A Lesbian Love in Prison, Part 7, Lesbian Romance. The morning Camille received her parole denial letter, she didn't cry. She had learned long ago that tears were currency in Hartwell Correctional Facility, and she had spent every last drop she owned on things far more worthy than paperwork. She folded the letter neatly, slid it beneath her mattress, and pressed her palm flat against the cold, concrete wall until she could feel her own heartbeat pushing back. 3 years she had been waiting for that letter to say something different. 3 years she had been counting, days on the inside of her left wrist with a tiny, broken pencil she kept hidden in the seam of her pillow. And now, standing in the pale gray light of Block C, she realized that some doors don't open from the inside no matter how hard you knock. And somehow, the woman sleeping in the bunk below her had become the only reason she still wanted to knock at all. Her name was Dara Voss, and she had arrived at Hartwell 14 months ago with a bruise along her jaw that nobody asked about and eyes the color of November sky just before a storm decides what it wants to be. Camille had noticed her the way you notice a crack in a beautiful ceiling. Something is wrong, but the beauty makes the wrongness easier to bear. Dara didn't speak much in those first weeks. She sat in the corner of the recreation room and read the same dog-eared copy of a Toni Morrison novel over and over, as though the answers to her specific grief were buried somewhere between those pages and she simply hadn't dug deep enough yet. Camille watched without meaning to, and then she watched on purpose. And then one Tuesday evening, when the overhead lights flickered 3 times, before dying completely and the whole block was plunged into a darkness so thick it had weight to it, Camille heard Dara whisper something that sounded like a prayer but carried the cadence of a goodbye, and something ancient inside Camille's chest refused to stay quiet. She had reached down from her bunk in that darkness and let her fingers find Dara's shoulder, not with intention or romance or any kind of calculation, but with the oldest human impulse there is, the need to say to another person, I know you are here. I know you are real. I know the dark doesn't get to swallow you whole while I am close enough to hold on to you. Dara had gone very still beneath her touch, and then something released in her. Camille felt it the way you feel a storm break. All that pressure becoming motion, becoming breath, becoming the quietest possible sound a human being can make when they finally stop pretending they are fine. They had stayed that way for a long time in the dark. Camille's hand on Dara's shoulder, Dara's fingers slowly coming up to press against Camille's knuckles as if to confirm the same thing back. I know you are here too. And something between them had shifted in that blackout that no returning of the lights could ever shift back. The weeks that followed were a careful, tender, terrifying unfolding. In a place designed to strip people of their softness, the 2 women found softness anyway, in the 30 minutes of shared yard time, in the passing of a contraband orange at dinner, in the way Dara would read aloud from her Morrison novel, in a low voice after lights out, and Camille would lie in the bunk above and feel the words fall over her like something holy. They never spoke directly about what was growing between them. To name it felt dangerous in a way that transcended the rules of the facility. This was deeper than the fear of punishment. It was the fear that naming something beautiful too early is the fastest way to make it fragile, and neither of them could afford fragile. What they had was the only warm thing either of them possessed, and they guarded it with the careful silence of 2 people who have learned through hard experience that the world is not always kind to women who love women, and is especially unkind to such women when they have already been decided upon as disposable. But love has never been particularly concerned with circumstances. It operates on its own calendar, moves at its own speed, and arrives fully formed in places where it was never expected and never officially invited. It arrived for Camille one afternoon in the prison library, when she looked up from the table where she was pretending to study and found Dara standing in the doorway with afternoon light coming through the narrow window behind her, turning the edges of her dark hair amber, and Camille understood with a certainty that bypassed every defense she had spent years constructing that she was completely, irrevocably, wholly in love with this woman, not in spite of where they were, not as an escape from where they were, but in the full, clear-eyed, deliberate way that asked for nothing except the chance to be honest. She didn't say any of this. She pushed the feeling down into The same place she kept every important thing, and smiled across the room, and Dara smiled back, and the library felt briefly like somewhere else entirely. The crisis came on a Thursday. It always comes on ordinary days. That is the cruelest thing about crisis. Camille learned through the underground current of whispered information that flows faster than any official communication through prison corridors that Dara had been called before the warden's office. There were accusations involving contraband. Someone had placed something in Dara's bunk, had informed on her, had constructed a small and vicious trap out of envy or cruelty, or the particular sport that some incarcerated people engage in when the walls close in and causing pain in others becomes the only available form of power. Camille stood in the center of the yard and felt the sky tilt. If Dara was charged, she would be moved to isolation. If she was moved to isolation, she would disappear into the gray administrative machinery of the facility, and Camille would have no way to reach her, no way to tell her that she was not alone, no way to hold the dark back from her. The thought was unbearable, in a way that clarified everything, immediately and permanently. What Camille did next was not logical and was not safe, and was not the kind of thing that helps a parole case. She went directly to the warden's office, something an inmate does not do without invitation, and she asked to speak. She told the truth, that she knew what had been planted, knew who had planted it, and knew the history of hostility that had preceded it. She offered names. She offered the specific and verifiable timeline of events that any fair investigation would confirm. She stood in that office with her hands at her sides and her voice completely steady, and she traded her invisibility, the carefully maintained unremarkable quality she had cultivated as armor, for the chance that Dara might be believed. She did not know if it would work. She did not know if it would cost her more years inside these walls. She knew only that love, when it is real, does not perform a cost-benefit analysis before it acts. It simply acts. It simply says, your safety matters more than my comfort, and I am not willing to watch you suffer when I have something that might help. The investigation took 9 days. 9 days during which Camille and Dara were kept apart by administrative precaution. 9 days of cafeteria, trays passed in silence and yard, time spent watching each other from opposite sides of the fence that divided the population groups, communicating in the small language they had built. A raised chin, a pressed hand against thigh, a particular stillness that said, I am here, I am holding, I have not let go. On the 9th evening, Dara returned to Block C. She walked through the door of the corridor, and Camille was there, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, and her face arranged into something that was attempting to be casual and failing completely. Dara stopped in front of her. She looked at her for a long time with those November sky eyes, and then she said nothing because nothing needed to be said. She took both of Camille's hands in hers and held them in the small space between their bodies, and Camille felt every one of those 9 days dissolve. They sat together on Camille's bunk that night after lights out, and Dara finally spoke about everything she had been carrying before. Hartwell, the relationship that had dismantled her, the family that had turned away, the cascade of circumstances that had ended with her inside these walls. Camille listened the way she had always listened to Dara, with her whole body, with complete attention, with the kind of presence that tells a person they are not being observed but witnessed. And then Camille spoke too, about her own arrival here, her own before the parole denial, the 3 years of marks on her wrist, the feeling of doors that don't open from the inside. They were 2 women sitting in the dark, telling each other true things, and in the morning nothing about their situation would be resolved. They would still be here, still inside, still subject to every uncertainty that governed their lives, but something had been resolved between them. Something irreversible and real had been set down in permanent ink. If you believe in the power of love to survive impossible places, if you believe that kindness between people is never wasted and never arrives too late, please show this story that belief. Let the like button be the smallest possible version of what Camille did when she walked into that office for Dara. Let it be the action that costs something, small but means something larger. In the weeks following that night, something in Camille reorganized itself. She began meeting with the prison's re-entry counselor, not because she expected anything from the process, but because Dara sat beside her during the first session and held the stack of paperwork, steady when Camille's hands were not. She began writing letters to an outside legal aid organization that specialized in cases like hers. She began carefully and methodically, rebuilding the argument for her own future, not because the parole board had given her a reason to, but because Dara had. Because love, when it is witnessed and returned and trusted, becomes the most effective argument against despair that has ever existed. She still kept the pencil in her pillow seam, but she had stopped marking days. She had started instead writing a single word each morning. The word was always the same. Pressed into the corner of a scrap of paper she kept folded against her heart. It said still. Still here. Still trying. Still holding. Still against all reasonable expectation. In love and being loved in return in a place that was designed to make that impossible, which is perhaps the most radical and beautiful form of resistance that two human beings are capable of. Before we reach the end of today's chapter, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling us what moment in this story stayed with you the longest, because your words are what keep this story alive and keep us telling it. The parole board meets again in 4 months. Camille's new application sits in a manila envelope in the counselor's office, thick with documentation and letters and the careful, accumulated evidence of a person who has not given up on herself. Dara's own hearing is 18 months away. They have made no promises about the outside world because the outside world is large and uncertain, and they are both people who have learned the hard way not to make promises they cannot control. What they have promised each other is smaller and more reliable than that. They have promised to be honest. They have promised not to disappear. They have promised that whatever comes, parole granted or denied, walls or no walls, November sky or clear blue open air, the thing that was built between them in the dark is not contingent on circumstances. It was not born of desperation. It was born of recognition, of two people seeing each other clearly in a place where clarity is rare and dangerous, and worth every risk it carries. And that kind of love, Camille had finally come to understand, is not something a system can process or a letter can deny. It exists in a category entirely its own, answering to nothing but itself, as permanent and patient, and quietly powerful as a heartbeat pressed against a cold concrete wall. Still going, still going, still going.